Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to By Design. We are on the Blizzard number 3. It's actually the Hollywood number, but Blizzard co-opted it. Cultural appropriation from Los Angeles. You never thought you would hear it, but the day has come. And the day has also come for me to talk about objectives. And the reason for this is actually because I'm working on an unannounced project right now that I don't want to talk too much about in detail, but it was requiring me to really reevaluate my stance on objectives. And some of it was also born out of a podcast that I did with Mesk very recently called A Magic Trick. It was the 25th episode or something of Big Boy Stable. I don't remember exactly what episode it was. The most recent one as of the recording of this video. And in that, towards the end of that podcast, Mesk talked about a mission in his StarCraft 2 campaign, Apex, where you are going to be able to reactivate or reclaim a bunch of production structures in some part of the map that is maybe difficult for you to access or difficult for you to hold while also holding other parts of the map. Maybe it's like distant from you or something like that. And your AI can, your AI ally will be able to claim that perhaps. I don't remember the exact situation, but the bottom line was that there was a side objective, a secondary objective in his RTS mission that involved you doing something that you don't normally see happen in a Melee game. And to me, that sort of took me by surprise, because usually when Mesk and I talk about RTS stuff on the podcast, we're very quick to talk about Melee stuff. And it just hadn't occurred to me how you would build something like a bunch of production out of nowhere, right? Normally you don't see that in a Melee game. So how would you reconcile that with the idea that you're trying to make an RTS mission? And that got me thinking that, how could I incorporate something like that properly? How could I integrate an objective like that properly into my own RTS campaigns? And that got me thinking of the topic of objectives themselves, what they are. And you think about a primary objective, and this isn't specific to RTS missions, but I'll be focusing on it because that's just how I am. But a primary objective is just a goal that a player or a team of players, if it's like a multiplayer game or something, they have to achieve that goal in order to complete a segment of gameplay or to, progress the gameplay in some way. And then you have secondary or bonus objectives. And these reward players for successfully splitting their focus, multitasking, fighting a war on multiple fronts. And if they are unsuccessful in completing that objective, usually the fact that they tried to and failed is punished in some way. Like then they don't have the sufficient resources to complete their main objective without maybe taking more risks, something to that extent. You could think of basically any time you've played an RTS mission that actually had side objectives. Sometimes they won't actually punish you for failing to grab them, but if it's like destroy, base number 2, when you only really have to destroy base number 1, maybe the reward is additional resources. You could hypothetically, it would probably look something like that if that was it. But it doesn't always have to be just destroying bases, just like your objective in a Melee game of StarCraft normally is, right? And that's sort of the basis for this conversation, is how do we have well-integrated objectives that aren't based in Melee gameplay exactly? And this sort of was a revelation to me, because I realized when you're playing video games, when you're playing a single-player experience especially, you're not always completing an objective. That's actually a very small portion of what you're doing. It might be splitting hairs, but you're usually working towards the completion of an objective, right? If you think of the objective as bringing a unit to a beacon or entering into this invisible location where after you bring a unit or yourself, like in an FPS or something, you bring yourself to the end of the level and that ends the level, that is the objective. And actually crossing that threshold is very, very small in terms of the amount of time it takes and what percentage of playtime is spent doing that exact thing. But that's your ultimate destination, and that is where you are going. That's what you're fighting for. It's just that the way that you accomplish that objective can be so different. In an RTS, bringing a unit to a beacon can be something like in, I think, the 4th mission of Inconsummate, where you have to bring Goska to a beacon that's on the other side of the map, and from where you start anyways. And in order to get to that point where you have access to that area, you have to destroy a bunch of enemy bases. You have to play an RTS, you have to use RTS mechanics, and you have to engage with enemy bases that are engaging with you. And, say what you want about the quality of that particular mission, I do feel like it was kind of a silly thing to do at that point, because by the time the player has reached that objective, they've effectively wiped the map, so it's really just padding for the sake of padding, and something that I probably should have removed, but didn't, so oh well. But then you look at something like the Delaran Shipyards in the original Brood War campaign, second mission of the UED campaign, and that campaign, or that particular mission, also involves bringing units to beacons as your main objective, but the way that you do it is very different. You're not engaging with all of the RTS mechanics. You're not really engaging with an AI that is engaging with you back. They're just static. They've got some pre-play stuff. Maybe there's some spell casting that they do or something here and there, just by virtue of how the AI works when even, without an AI script running. But there's no real behavior exerted outside of that by the AI, and so they're not really engaging with you. And so this is sort of the basis for our conversation, is these two things, or these two examples, are both basically the same thing, bringing some unit to a beacon, and that's like bringing a unit or yourself in an FPS or whatever to a location in the game world to complete an objective. And yet the way that you can accomplish that objective, the way that you get to the point where you are ready to accomplish that objective, right, where you are at that finish line, can be completely different pathways. So I think well-integrated objectives essentially do two things. They provide a focal point for gameplay, and they provide a focal point for characterization. Because, again, gameplay is a storytelling tool, and the way that a player experiences your game will affect how they feel about your story. I think that's a pretty reasonable sort of position to hold, especially when you're talking about the stuff that I have talked about before. So poorly integrated objectives will distract from both of those things. One or both, we'll say. So they could distract from gameplay by being a gimmick, by making it so that in order to complete the objective, you have to complete a bound or, chase a critter across the map or something. Something like that could be potentially very damaging, very distracting from the core gameplay of an RTS. And for characterization purposes, maybe they introduce some sort of plot hole by virtue of you completing them. Or maybe they make the enemy look like a fool. Maybe they make the enemy look really goofy when you're supposed to respect them as a threat. And so you could see where both of those could very easily occur in the same thing, in the same objective, with the same objective. So I think players should be able to interact with objectives with whatever playstyle, with whatever tools and strategies they prefer. And that's how you support multiple playstyles in the same mission, in the same game. And so if you're going to give me, half of the tech or all of the tech of a race in an RTS mission, but then only make it so that it's viable to use half of those options, I don't necessarily agree with that, because if I'm skilled enough at using one of the options, I should be able to use that to its maximum effectiveness, or whatever effectiveness I can use it to, and complete the mission that way, right? So recently we've seen an example playing DK's campaign where Impending Doom, where they would, there was an enemy structure that periodically, through a trigger, would remove all of our shields. And we couldn't really engage with this. This was just something that happened. And so our playstyle had to adapt to that. And it was not really using all of the tech available to us. He also just would disallow a bunch of Stargates, but that's sort of a little bit different, although it is still in the same neighborhood. So I don't think there was a single mission where we got to use Stargates, actually. Maybe the second one with that particular character. But the specifics, I think, are pretty clear in this case. You're not really able to use the same amount of strategies as you would if that mechanic weren't there. And so that component of game design, of level design, is not really helping with the objectives integration into the overall level. I also think that AI, in a single player or a cooperative setting, should be able to interact with these objectives as well. So, for example, if you are supposed to be defending an AI ally, or one of your friends, and you're playing the second mission or the third mission of Hydra of Hydra Rebel Yell. You've got Kerrigan as player 2, and she's helping the boys out, the boys in blue, in Desperate Alliance. That's the mission name. And so this is the mission where the Magistrate's under attack, and he's got to hold out for 30 minutes before the Sons of Gorhal get to him. And so, obviously, this objective to survive means that the boys in blue have to survive, and Kerrigan also has to survive. And so this is a really easy one to look at, because if the AI destroys the Terran base, then you've failed your mission. But if the AI does not destroy your base, and you survive that base, right, you defend it until it survives, until the time has been allotted, at that point, you have won. And so the way that the players on either side of the spectrum, be they AI enemies or human players or AI allies, the way that they win is integrated with that objective. So another example would be, the idea behind the fifth mission of Inconsummate, where you are just supposed to be destroying Kor Shakal, the great temple thing, the great forum, that's it. And you're supposed to be doing that so that you can, isolate Aldaris. So the way that you win that mission is by destroying that objective, and the way that you could potentially lose that mission is if obviously you've failed the mission if at the end of the playtime that structure is still standing. And so that's another example of the sort of the same idea. As far as story goes, I think players should be able to ascertain valuable story info from the objectives. So this also could extend to if you looked at the way that the AI defended that Great Forum structure in that 5th mission of Inconsummate, it was clearly very high priority. They had an entire player dedicated just for defense, just for exhaustive defense of that structure. They had an entire garrison there. And the other AI, if you left them on the map, would also flock to the defense of that central structure. So you can clearly see that by way of the way that the players on the map are behaving and responding to your aggression, that they themselves are trying to win by keeping that structure alive. And so that's how you see them engaging with that. That is how the gameplay tells that story, that structure is important. It's not just that you have to complete it. In order to complete the mission, you have to destroy it. It's also that the AI are defending it with, tooth and nail. And so that makes you feel like, oh, these AI care about that structure because that is their win condition. Keeping that alive is their win condition, just like destroying it is mine. And so it will create that association in people's heads. So that's an example of how it would help further the characterization, because you start to think these Protoss really want this structure to stand, and they're fighting tooth and nail for me to not be able to defeat it, not be able to destroy it. That's how you can see that these Protoss care about the structure, they're willing to die for it, whatever. You can start to read in as much as you want, however invested you are and immersed you are into the story. It will contribute towards that. The objective in this case is well integrated, I think. So let's go back to the Delarian Shipyards example, because I want to talk about that. I feel like it's actually really, really bad. And it's not just because it's a micro mission. I'm just talking about the objective itself. The actual objective could be fine. Like, you could say bringing a unit to a beacon. Well, I'll give you an example of how to fix it, but let's go over it exactly. The objective by itself, just by itself without any gameplay, with just looking at it on paper, it actually does distract from the characterization, because the inconsistency here is that there's one pilot unit, you bring it to a beacon, and then a battlecruiser flies away, and it's supposed to have like a crew of 300 people or something. And so that's obviously kind of whack. We can dispense with that, or we can change the battlecruiser into another unit that only requires a single pilot. But either way, you can still have that element there. You can still have bringing pilots to beacons to collect units that you can't currently train and obtain them, that are, in a way that they are useful as well to the ultimate objective, which ends up being to destroy the enemy's fleet. You could still even have that in there as the final phase of gameplay. But the implementation distracts from gameplay itself, because the player doesn't use enough of the mechanics of an RTS, or in fact of any other genre either, because they're just engaging with an AI that is completely static. You're not really engaged by the level design or by the AI. The AI aren't running any AI scripts as far as I'm aware, and they certainly don't behave like they do. The AI do not interact with the objectives themselves. They just have units pre-placed there. And so at that point, they're just a bunch of junk waiting to be grinded through. And they don't engage with that. They don't defend those battlecruisers. They don't try to take them themselves with their own pilots to fly them away and or to use against you in an aggressive fashion. And so the way that you could fix this, gameplay-wise, we already talked about how to fix the inconsistency, converting the battlecruiser to another unit that only requires a pilot, or maybe some other method of, just seizing control of the area and then having an AI, drop some men in to presumably garrison the crew and strong arm them into helping you. Something like that could work as well. However you wanted to do that, that's sort of your own jurisdiction as a mapper, as a storyteller. But the gameplay itself poses a more interesting problem, because, again, bringing a unit to a beacon is not necessarily a terrible thing, and not necessarily a terrible way to cross the finish line and to engage with an objective. But getting to the point where you bring that unit to the beacon, where you click that unit and you right-click them onto the beacon, that is what counts. That's what the player is going to be spending most of their time in this mission doing. And so if you convert it into a level that uses a more well-rounded set of RTS mechanics, and you integrate it with the AI so that the player's opponent will interact with the objective, so that maybe, again, they are commandeering the cruisers themselves, they are trying to seize and reinforce the areas and make it so that the player has to work harder in order to gain access to those hangar bays. That would be another example of how you could improve this mission. You make it so that the player has to use RTS mechanics somewhat skillfully in order to win, and then it could be a legitimate RTS mission with a non-standard, non-melee approach to its gameplay and its objectives, right? The finish line is not just destroying all of the enemy bases, not just destroying every one of their missile turrets on fucking islands. The objective is actually to commandeer battlecruisers and to destroy the enemy's fleet of battlecruisers. And you're engaging with an objective, and the AI is engaging with theirs to try to build up their fleet. And it could be wonderful and wonderfully dynamic compared to a normal melee. It could be a lovely breath of fresh air for the people who aren't as interested in just wiping a map of enemy dots or destroying all enemy production or whatever. And you can still have those non-standard objectives. It's just that the way that you're doing them, the way that you're accomplishing them, is very much a distinction. You know, it's not just a micro mission where you're moving into bunkers because you have medics and you're 3-3 upgrades from the start. You know, you actually have to tech up and you have to field an army and all of these other RTS mechanics that you don't have to worry about in the stock vanilla mission. And so I'm going to give an example of another better, well-integrated objective, in my opinion. Certainly not without its flaws, but we can see how to improve it, just like I talked about the Delirian Shipyards one. So if we look at the big push of Hydro Rebel Yell, this is the 8th mission, where it's a massive TVT, you've got an AI ally in the back, and of course this is co-op, but it's optional, so you could be playing it single player. Now, the objective here also is non-standard. The objective is to plant emitters by bringing a hero to a beacon. Oh, wow, bringing a unit to a beacon. Who would have thought? But it's more than just bringing the unit to the beacon. That unit also cannot die because it's a hero. And that unit, once it is brought there, plants a structure that, or a power-up, in this case, the emitter, that also cannot die. So you'll effectively have 2 hero units as soon as you get planted. You know, these are defeat conditions for you and victory conditions for the AI should they destroy them. And so, I mean, just off the top of your head, you can think of a bunch of different ways that the AI could interact with this objective. Because the sites are predetermined, they're not random, so you have to plant them in specific areas, which means the players have to clear out any opposition and defenses that are over in those regions to plant some of their own defenses and hold out and bunker down. And so the way that it currently works is that small attack waves do get launched at the emitters when they get planted. And at the same time, there's obviously the emergent gameplay of the player trying to focus on defending those regions with the emitters, which means that their focuses will be split between that and attacking another base if they're also doing that, or defending against attacks that are coming from elsewhere, that are attacking, you know, production facilities and command centers and stuff, and, you know, expansions, the like. So you can easily see where the gameplay is entirely rooted in the RTS mechanics, as well as the way that you accomplish that objective isn't just taking, you know, left-clicking a hero, right-clicking a beacon. It's also to bunker, you know, clear out the enemy opposition in that area, clear out all of their defenses, build some of your own, make sure that you're defending the assets of interest, right? The people of interest in this case, and also make sure that you are still not losing the RTS metagame objective of, continuing to have your resources and expansions, continuing to have your production structures pumping out units and microing as well as you can within the midst of all that. And so it's certainly another layer of complexity in a sense, but it's still built around building defenses and taking more map control and all of that other stuff. So it's still integrated to the core game. It's not a distraction on the gameplay sense. And of course, the emergent storytelling that happens just by virtue of the gameplay. For one, you're characterizing the setting as this area where I'm planting the emitter must be important because I want, the emitter attracts Zerg. And so clearly this area must need Zerg in order to defeat it or something. And so that's sort of like the subtext of planting the emitter there, as this is like an asset of interest, perhaps, for the enemies. Then you have the idea that they also personify that idea by trying to defend those planting sites where you're going to plant the emitters. They try to defend those areas, which makes it very clear that this is an important asset for them. And then they will also be attacking you while they're there and trying to take advantage of your distraction. So they're aware of what you're doing. They recognize that you are trying to plant these emitters in these locations. And so they're defending those locations, they're attacking those locations when you plant, and they're attacking other locations while you're planting as well to try and distract you so that they can maybe snipe an emitter, who knows. The way that you would improve this mechanic is to further reinforce these themes, right? The idea that the AI will try to reinforce and defend those emitter sites, as well as launching greater assaults at the emitters, or maybe the more emitters you plant, the more they focus on the emitter sites themselves, trying to snipe those emitters and deny you the plant, as opposed to, like, maybe in the first few sets, they're like, well, okay, they plant one emitter or they plant two emitters, then maybe it's okay. We can have them plant two, but if they plant the third one out of four, then we got to start watching out. We got to try to snipe that. And of course, the final one would be the one where they were focusing all of their attention on that final emitter. And so it really is like a final stand in that case. And so I could see that as a way of improving it, to improve the idea that the AI have some sort of awareness for what they are doing. And so I think that is another way that you could work that in. So I guess we'll close this subject by another example. And this is the example from the project that I'm working on that hasn't been announced. It's a single player campaign. And there is an objective where it's a bonus objective. So it's not like the primary ones that we've been talking about so far. So this bonus objective is actually to recover a star field. So it's a bunch of stargates. There's a bunch of production, as well as a fleet beacon, which is a tech structure that you can't build in that mission. But however, you will be able to, once you unlock it, you can rebuild it if you want. But the idea is that by the time, by completing this bonus objective, you gain access to tech you wouldn't be able to use otherwise. And so this objective is also something that can be destroyed by your enemies. So if they destroy it by the time you get there, well, obviously you're not going to be able to repower it and recover it. Also, if you give it up, there is a small resource area there, so you are depriving yourself of resources and allowing your AI enemies to obtain those resources. And so that's obviously somewhat of an issue. And in order to be reached and defended by the player, they have to be using RTS mechanics skillfully. And they have to be splitting their focus, not to destroy an enemy stronghold, not to deprive an enemy of an asset, but just to claim a potential asset for their own, deprive an enemy of a potential asset, as opposed to launching an assault on an enemy base somewhere else. And so you can see where this could easily become an interesting bonus objective by nature, because you're telling the player, hey, this area doesn't actually have any guaranteed value for you. You have to complete it in a certain amount of time for it to have value. Because if you go here and you spend all this time, preparing an army and moving them to this area of the map that's relatively remote, it's far away from your main, it's far away from, your allies' main, it's far away from a lot of other stuff. You might be completely out of position and just get there only to find out, actually, it's already been destroyed and the area's, in the process of being taken by your enemy or something like that. And so you need to be scouting this out, right? That's an RTS mechanic. You need to be building your army, another RTS mechanic, moving it to that location, which brings your other, areas of spheres of influence into question. AI could attack you and your forces could be out of position. And you're not necessarily guaranteed to get anything out of it or to destroy an enemy stronghold, because you don't know necessarily, unless you scout, of course, if the AI has expanded there. And you're obviously, if they haven't expanded there, then there's no chance of you destroying an enemy asset just by going over there. It's an investment into the future, and you can choose to do that if you want to. And so that bonus objective rewards the player for, again, splitting their focus and multitasking. If they are able to do that, then they will be rewarded with those production structures. And it is somewhat of an experiment, but it's also, I think, a non-standard. You wouldn't see random Stargates able to be recovered in a Melee game, obviously. But those altered game rules are still built into RTS mechanics. They still provide you a reward that is not a gimmick based on RTS mechanics. You still have to use them and spend money in order to make use of them. And you get a tech structure, and that gives you access to some other units and some other upgrades that you weren't previously able to get. And so you can see where this is very simple to work into an RTS environment, because it's still built around RTS mechanics. And the resource area is also somewhat valuable, which obviously I already mentioned. So I think that's a good recipe, a good blueprint for a bonus objective that not only the players want to achieve and basically seize control of, they also want to deprive their enemies of doing it. Because maybe their enemies could take that area, maybe their enemies could benefit from those resources. You can see in a potential realm where your opponents could be using this bonus objective to their own gain and potentially killing you with those things and using that to win over you. And so it ticks all the boxes, I think. And so I hope that this by design log has been somewhat interesting anyways. I do think that bonus objectives, primary objectives that are not necessarily rooted in just destroying an enemy outright by destroying all of their buildings or all their production, I think those can be useful, and those can be implemented successfully in an RTS environment without seeming like gimmicks and without distracting from the overall experience. And that's really why I wanted to make this particular video. I wanted to give you guys the rundown of what an objective really looks like and what I think makes a well-integrated objective versus a poorly integrated one. And I hope that you guys have learned something from it. That is more or less all I have to say on the subject right now, but I'm positive that I will be learning a lot about objectives that are not necessarily just destroying all enemy production structures the more I continue to design campaigns. Because I do recognize that it is something that you probably, you could see it getting a little boring, a little bland, especially if you're not already inclined to seek out fully RTS experiences, and you're trying out a campaign and it's all about destroying enemy production structures. Maybe you want a little something to sweeten the pot and to give you an incentive to do something completely different, which is where the bonus objectives would come in, or to make it so that it's a little bit more dynamic for the benefit of your story, so that you could tell it a different kind of story than just there's like a military asset here that the AI want to defend, you've got to kill it, or you have to defend it from the AI, and maybe that military asset is useful in some way, not just a neutral structure or a special structure that, like in Consummate's example, where the Great Forum structure didn't actually serve a gameplay purpose. It was more about the role-playing story in your head of, oh yeah, that's where the Protoss leaders are, and so you destroy it and you win the mission. It could be more like, this is an ion cannon, and it will completely wipe me the fuck off the map, so I gotta destroy it, right? Something like that could be more interesting in terms of it's like gives you a gameplay incentive to interact with it, as well as furthering the characterization of the setting and the factions and the characters and all that other stuff. So I'm excited to see what other thoughts I end up having on the objectives sort of puzzle, that piece of the RTS mission puzzle. And I'm interested in seeing some examples from you guys. If you could comment below and tell me some examples of objectives that you think have been successful or maybe atrocious, whatever you feel in the mood for. But obviously I've played a lot of campaigns. You guys have seen a lot of campaigns, a lot of RTS titles, and I'm interested in seeing what you guys have to say on this particular topic, because it's one that I haven't really considered that much. I'm still exploring mentally, and so if you guys can help me out with that, it'd be much appreciated. So I'll see you guys on the next video. Probably won't be a by design video. I know that these have been back to back, but don't get used to it. We're going to be back with Dark Colony soon enough, so stay excited for that, and I will see you guys next time.